Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating. We're going to take a journey that stretches across millennia and continents, connecting an ancient Middle Eastern archaeological site all the way to modern West African sociopolitics. We're going to explore the deep and honestly often dark anatomy of human conflict. By drawing on historical archaeology, theological studies, and contemporary academic research, we'll see exactly how ancient cycles of vengeance are literally still playing out today. Have you ever wondered why history seems to just constantly repeat itself? Well, let's get right into it.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, unearthing ancient Shechem. Second, the Sacred Blood Covenant. Third, the Dinah episode. Fourth, modern reprisal attacks. And finally, breaking the cycle.
All right, part one, unearthing ancient Shechem.
Okay, so to really grasp this conflict, we've got to start at the physical stage. We're anchoring our historical investigation with this incredible archaeological journal article by Siegfried H. Horn. Because of its location at the eastern entrance of the only east-west mountain pass in central Palestine, Shechem was a vital artery back in the day. In fact, it was the very first city of Palestine mentioned in the Bible. But get this, even before that, its absolute first historical mention comes from an Egyptian hieroglyphic stone text. It's the biography of an official named Hu-Sebek, and it dates all the way back to around 1878 BC. The Egyptians were actually there on a military campaign to punish Shechem for some unrecorded crime.
And excavations show Shechem's roots are incredibly deep, starting with camping sites from the Chalcolithic period in the 4th millennium BC. By the Middle Bronze Age 2A, so between 1850 and 1750 BC, it was a fully built-up, established settlement. To put that into perspective, by the time the biblical patriarch Abraham arrived and pitched his tent there, Shechem was already a thriving, established location.
Now, right around 1750 BC, Shechem gets these massive physical upgrades. The city gained a 2.5-meter wide brick wall that was later reinforced by a staggering 30-meter wide earthen embankment built by the Hyksos, which was held in place by a 5-meter high stone wall. But here's the crazy part. Their defenses weren't just physical. They were psychological and, frankly, magical. Archaeologists actually found Egyptian execration texts. Think of these basically like ancient voodoo dolls. They were crudely fashioned clay figurines of bound Palestinian captives. The names of their enemies, including an Amorite ruler of Shechem named Abis-Haddu, were literally written on them with curses. The figurines were then smashed in these elaborate ceremonies to render the enemies impotent. This really sets the stage of a city that is just absolutely steeped in ancient militaristic conflict.
Moving right along to part two, the Sacred Blood Covenant.
So, drawing on our theological sources, we really need to nail down the definition of the Brit Milah, or the covenant of circumcision. According to the text, this was designed as an eternal, physical bond between God and the house of Israel. But we have to understand how ancient covenants worked. Back then, blood spilled during a covenant was meant as a very ominous, visible warning of the severe consequences of breaking it. Usually, an animal was sacrificed, but in this specific covenant, the mark was placed directly on the human body itself. It symbolized that abandoning the covenant meant being cut off entirely from the people.
The theological source we're analyzing points out a really stark contrast between the intent of this covenant and the norms of the surrounding cultures. The biblical intent of the rite was all about the submission of fleshly instincts, placing God first above base desires. And it was performed on the 8th day as a symbol of eternity. Now, this is contrasted directly with the surrounding pagan cultures, which, the source notes, heavily utilize fertility idols, phallic pillars, and unrestrained sexual freedom. The covenant was meant to be a private, physical reminder to control primal instincts and act with integrity and love.
Which brings us to part 3, the Dinah episode.
Okay, so according to the text in Genesis chapter 34, the main inciting incident happens when the prince of the city, a guy whose name is also Shechem, sees Dinah, the daughter of the patriarch Jacob. The text uses incredibly intense language to describe that Shechem took her by force, violating her. In the cultural context of that time, this was not just a crime against one individual. It was a massive disgrace and dishonor brought upon Jacob's entire family. When Dinah's brothers, specifically Simeon and Levi, heard what happened, they were mortified and overwhelmed with this exceedingly wrathful grief.
What happens next is a dark and incredibly calculated retaliation. The source outlines the steps very clearly. First, Shechem and his father propose intermarriage. They're basically attempting to smooth over the crime with an offer of property and a political alliance. Second, Simeon and Levi, operating with deep deception, agree to the marriage, but they set a very strict condition. All the men of Shechem must undergo the sacred blood covenant of circumcision. The Shechemites agree to this, largely hoping to absorb the Hebrews' wealth. Finally, the tragic irony. On the third day, when the men of Shechem are completely incapacitated by the physical pain of the procedure, Simeon and Levi weaponize this sacred covenant of peace. They enter the city, brutally slaughter every single male, and plunder the city to avenge their sister.
The theologian John Calvin actually analyzed this exact text and asked a really powerful question. Who had constituted them judges that they should dare, with their own hands, to execute vengeance? Calvin argued that while the prince definitely acted wickedly, it was far more atrocious for the brothers to murder an entire people for the crime of one man. It was completely disproportionate revenge. And you know, it's a question we still struggle with today when we feel wronged. At what point does justice cross the line and just become pure vengeance?
Let's bring this into the present. Part 4. Modern reprisal attacks.
We are pulling from a Nigerian academic source here that details how contemporary conflicts deeply mirror the tribal retaliations we just looked at. For instance, following the 2011 presidential elections, protests degenerated into violent riots that left over 800 people dead, with communities trapped in this endless cycle of killing and burning each other's properties in direct retaliation. Then you have Boko Haram, an insurgency driven by a strict ideology, carrying out suicide bombings and attacks, and further, the deadly Fulani versus Barome clashes over land ownership in Jos, which feature endless claims of reprisals and counter-reprisals. It's wild because, just like the ancient tribes of Simeon and Levi, modern groups are using perceived or real injustices to justify mass violence against entire communities.
Now, under international law, for a reprisal to even be considered legitimate, it has to meet some really strict criteria. First, objectivity. Second, subsidiarity, meaning it must absolutely be a last resort. And third, proportionality, meaning the response has to actually match the injury. But as we can see, both the ancient brothers Simeon and Levi and modern sectarian groups almost always fail this legal test. Their actions are driven by ideological bias, they escalate immediately to violence, and they are vastly disproportionate, often targeting completely innocent civilians. The academic source notes that reprisals don't restore equilibrium, they just create an infinite series of retaliatory acts.
So, how do we stop it? Part 5. Breaking the cycle.
To get to the absolute root of the problem, our academic text references the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant proposed that human beings basically have a choice to make the moral law their governing maxim. Radical evil occurs when humans consciously choose to subordinate the requirements of morality to their own self-conceit or egoistic alternative. Whether it's the ancient prince of Shechem taking exactly what he wanted, or modern insurgents forcing their ideology onto others, this prioritization of self over universal morality is the exact spark that ignites the whole cycle of retaliation. But thankfully, there's a counterweight to this radical evil. Just listen to this powerful quote from Nelson Mandela, which is featured in the source text. Mandela shifts the focus back to human agency, but this time, for good. He points out that systemic issues like poverty and injustice, which we know are massive breeding grounds for frustration, terrorism, and violent uprisings, are completely man-made. Therefore, they can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Human greatness can actively solve the systemic inequalities that breed these violent cycles. We literally have the power to fix it.
So how do we actually pull that off? Well, the academic text lays out some tangible remedies drawn from studying both the massive failures of Genesis 34 and modern Nigerian crises. First, engage in sincere dialogue. The treaty in Shechem failed miserably because both sides were hypocritical and deceitful. Second, practice genuine forgiveness and tolerance. As Desmond Tutu noted, without forgiveness, there is no future. Third, ensure good governance and the equitable distribution of resources. This removes the economic deprivations that constantly fuel insurgencies. And finally, implement strict policies to check arms proliferation, literally physically disarming the cycles of violence.
Wow, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, all the way from the 4,000-year-old Cyclopean walls of Shechem to the modern political challenges in Nigeria. We've seen firsthand how easily sacred concepts can be weaponized and how the human instinct for disproportionate revenge absolutely transcends time and culture. So I want to leave you with this final question to chew on. How can we apply these ancient lessons to break the cycle of reprisal in our own modern conflicts? Understanding the past is the very first step, but choosing not to repeat it, that's the next. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.